Stroke leads to a number of impairments, and one of the most prevalent impairment we observe in these patients is hemiparesis. It affects the upper extremity, and soon patients can experience recovery when exposed to therapy, but after several months of treatment, they are discharged, and we often observe huge deterioration. One explanation for this deterioration would be that after hospital discharge, those skills that are acquired during the rehabilitation process stop being trained. And through motor adaptation mechanisms, patients may modify the execution of a movement in order to maintain performance. They may do this either by modifying how the current action is executed or by even selecting a completely different action, for instance, using the less affected arm. These solutions may enhance performance immediately, but they may be a suboptimal solution in the long term because learning is an iterative process. If the action that needs to be trained is not selected, then the subject is not exposed to error and there is no learning. Actually, we know that body parts and actions compete for representation in our brains. And we know that those actions that are not used often lose representation. This is the core of what has been called learn on use, where the patient tends to overuse the non-affected arm due to the loss in control, in motor control, when using the paretic one. And due to that, the patient is not exposed to error, there's no further learning, and the outcome of the actions performed with the paretic arm are poor. So this lowers the future probability of selecting this action again. So this engages the patient into a vicious cycle of recovery, in which the deterioration is projected, right? But there is a way to stop and even reverse this vicious cycle, and it has been proposed before, actually originally by Taub and further explored by other authors, and this is a therapy called constraint-induced movement therapy. So this therapy proposes to restrain or constrain the movement of the less affected arm, so this overuse of the non-affected arm cannot take place, and the patients are somehow forced, therefore, to use the more affected arm to perform the activities of daily living. So it operates at the level of action selection. Patients are not able to select which limb to use anymore, since they are forced to use the affected arm most of the time. And even though constraint-induced movement therapy has shown to be quite effective in promoting recovery, it is not suitable for most of the patients. Actually, only 7 to 13% of these patients can benefit from this type of therapy, since many of these patients take into account that they may present depression, emotional issues, or they may not have access to support from therapists. So this type of therapy, constraint-induced therapy, requires supervision. Otherwise, it could be dangerous for the patient. So there are many patients that cannot benefit from this type of therapy, and for this reason, we thought about offering an alternative. Instead of forcing the use of the affected arm, we could reinforce it by operating at the level of the error. We could use, for instance, virtual reality to reduce sensory error magnitudes, and through these mechanisms, we hypothesized that we could have an effect on action selection and promote learning, relearning, and recovery. And we start from this idea, this hypothesis, by implementing a computational model of action selection and motor recovery that actually grounds on previous work from Hidaka and Schweighofer and colleagues. In this model, it's a functional model that simulates reaching movements towards a target. it is divided in two units, a motor unit and an action selection unit. The motor unit is composed of a set or a pool of neurons that are sensitive to specific angle directions and that are, let's say that to describe them, we could say that they fire more when the target appears at specific directions. So they have specific angle sensitivities or direction sensitivities. And we divide this pool of neurons into groups, one that is dedicated to each of the hemispheres, brain hemispheres. The action selection unit, it's an interactive race model, also composed by a pool of neurons, one dedicated to each action that is possible in this case. Action one would correspond with selecting the right arm to reach the target, and action two would be selecting the left arm. And this action selection unit is taking into account the expected cost and the expected success of the action that is planned by the motor unit in order to take a decision about which action to execute. So each motor unit, the right and the left, are computing two different plans simultaneously corresponding to the two limbs. And these are the two plans, motor plans, that compete for execution. So the model also, after taking a decision and executing it, is updated through three different mechanisms, two that are updating the sensitivities of the neurons that compose the motor unit through use-dependent learning and error-based learning, and a third learning mechanism that is adjusting the action selection unit in order to optimize future decision making. So what we do is, after implementing this model, we now simulate a stroke. So in first place, we simulate a healthy subject for that, just exposing it to repeated reaching movements towards targets appearing at different directions. Now we induce a stroke by removing certain number of neurons, those that are sensitive in the left motor cortex, those that are sensitive to directions towards the upper right corner of the workspace. And now we expose the patient to training again. So we are going to simulate three different conditions of treatment. The first one is no treatment, no therapy. The second one is constrained induced movement therapy, in which we force the use of the affected arm. And the third one is reinforced induced movement therapy, in which we do not force the use of any arm. We just manipulate the error or the reinforcement that we provide for learning after the execution of the action. Then we also simulate a follow-up period in which no therapy is administered. And what we observe is that in the motor cortex, in the left motor cortex, the one affected by the injury that we simulated, we can see reorganization associated to all the therapies we simulated. And in the case of the no treatment therapy, we do not see any repair. So here we extend the two therapies to three by introducing one more therapy that combines constraint-induced movement therapy and reinforcement-induced movement therapy. This means that in 70% of the trials, we are reinforcing the use of the affected arm by manipulating the error, and in 30% of the trials, we are forcing the use of the affected arm. And what we see is that actually this is the solution that seems to be more effective for recovering not only motor function, but non-pathological arm selection patterns. And these results, when compared to constraint-induced movement therapy and to purely reinforced induced movement therapy, seem to be actually very similar. But they are highly optimal in comparison to no therapy, the no therapy condition. So based on these results, we now proceeded to test them in a clinical trial. And for that, we first designed what we call the reinforcement-induced movement therapy. So how to implement it. And it is composed by four main blocks that are building the therapy. So two of them are related to how we implement an implicit reinforcement mechanism, and the other two are related to the explicit reinforcement that we are providing. So regarding the implicit reinforcement, we augment goal-oriented movements in order to reduce implicit error. And we also introduce shaping through training. So we adapt the challenge of the training to the patient's capabilities. We progressively adapt it. Regarding the explicit reinforcement, we limit compensatory movements. Specifically, we limit trunk overcompensation through trunk displacement, and also overcompensations related to the overuse of the non-affected arm. And in second place, through the explicit reinforcement mechanism, we also provide feedback about performance through a scoring system. So in this case, we now design an experiment, a clinical trial, in which two groups are exposed to a virtual reality-based therapy. And the only difference in between the two groups is that in one of them, the experimental one, we are going to provide augmented goal-oriented movement. So we're going to explore the effects of this specific component of the reinforcement-induced movement therapy. After 6 weeks of therapy, we observed that the experimental group shows a higher probability of selecting the affected arm when compared to baseline, and this is significantly different from the control group, the one that was not exposed to augmented goal-oriented movements in virtual reality. Also, we perform a sequential analysis of hand selection, and we see that when patients were successful or failed in the previous trial, this had a significant effect on the probability of using the affected arm in the subsequent trial. This only occurred when they were using the affected arm, which apparently shows that these patients are very or highly sensitive to failure when using the affected limb. Therefore, reinforcement may have an important potential here for promoting recovery and promoting action selection. So amplifying goal-oriented movements of the paralytic limb promotes arm use, and amplifying goal-oriented movements of the paralytic limb also seems to reduce the patient's sensitivity to failure. Because when we expose them to augmented goal-oriented movements, we saw that this high sensitivity to failure disappeared. Not in the control group, but we observed it only in the experimental group, the one that was exposed to these goal-oriented movements. Finally, we explored the effects of 6 weeks of therapy on clinical scales, on the recovery of motor function and impairment. So at the level of impairment, we observe an improvement captured by the Fugl-Meyer scale, an improvement in the upper extremity that is significantly higher for the experimental group when compared to the control group during the follow-up. So after the treatment ended, the experimental group, the one exposed to goal-oriented augmentation, still experienced further recovery. And in the CAHI, we also observed a similar trend, although not significant. So to conclude, we presented data showing that the provision of implicit reinforcement in reinforcement-induced movement therapy protocols may be a key factor for challenging the patient's perceived competence, leading to immediate improvements in arm use and rising the intensity of the training. And also we showed a computational model that predicts that mild restriction of the less affected limb paired with reinforcement strategies could lead to an effective rehabilitation approach.